The Australian Financial Review.
Welcome to The Fin, Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray with political editor Phil Coorey, Defence and Foreign Affairs correspondent Andrew Tillett, and economics editor John Keogh.
Well, this is the sweetest victory of all.
It's Tuesday, April 29.
I have always believed in miracles.
Who do you trust to keep the economy strong? Who do you trust to keep interest rates low?
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
The light on the hill.
Set it aflame again. Tonight, the Australian people have voted for change.
Hi Phil, Andrew, John.
Hi, Lisa.
G'day, how you going?
G'day.
Are you all exhausted?
No, just getting ready, mate. It's going to only get busier now.
This is the busiest week of them all, I think.
This is the busiest week of them all. So we've been meeting every week with a panel of the Financial Review's finest political minds to discuss the campaign, the mishaps, the triumphs, and the odd policy announcement. We'll come back next week to wrap up the result, if there is a result by then. But this is your last chance to have a say before voters officially head to the polls on Saturday. Phil, last week you interviewed the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, and he issued a last-minute warning about the pitfalls of minority government. Labor's leading in the polls, but what does this warning suggest about how worried they are that they're not going to get the numbers outright? Should they be worried?
Yeah, at least, look, it was more a plea than a warning, I guess, and it came from someone who clearly doesn't want to have to be part of another minority government. If you remember when the first and only one we had between 2010 and 2013, Albanese was the manager of government business, which meant he was basically the chief wrangler. And it is one of his skills, is wrangling people and cutting deals. And I suspect if it weren't for him, that government wouldn't have lasted half as long as it did. And I think he was, in the interview with myself, he was basically saying, look, I've been in one of these things. They're not great. They're very difficult. And voters lack confidence in them. And the decision-making is compromised because you sit around the cabinet table or the ERC and you make a decision, but then you have to second-guess, what the various minor parties who aren't part of that decision-making process are then going to want. So he said, in the eyes of many voters, they lack a legitimacy and everything's twice as hard as it has to be. Now, you could expect him to say that because he doesn't want to have to govern with having to have to run everything past the Greens or the Teals or anyone else. But I think there is an element of truth in that because just based on the experience last time.
But do you think they're looking at the numbers and saying, hang on a sec, we really need a final push here?
100%. Yeah, it's still pretty close, Lisa. I mean, one of the biggest problems the Labor Party's had in the last few weeks is the weight of expectation. It was a millstone for Dutton leading up to the campaign, and then it's become a bit of a millstone for Albanese. A lot of this because people don't either understand polls properly or they're not reported very responsibly. So they say, Albanese's leading in the polls. Well, he may be ahead 51-49, but that means he's still further back than what he was at the last election and is going to go backwards. And backwards for him means minority government. So they have, and then the bookmakers get carried away and this sentiment takes hold and everyone has to start claiming underdog status again. So, look, it's very tight. As we sit here, I suspect the two-party preferred break is about 52 to Labor, 48 to the coalition. At the last election, it was 52.4, I think, to Labor. So they're sort of roughly where they were at the last election. And that gave them the tiniest of majorities based on an anomaly in WA. And things have changed a lot since then. Labor's going to lose seats in Victoria that they held last time because Victoria is such a basket case for them. So even though the 52% might reflect the result of the last election, at a granular level, it's going to be different. So, he is being far from complacent and with good reason.
Albanese keeps saying that he won't do a deal with the Greens to form government. So how would it work?
Well, what he means when he says that is he's not going to do what Julia Gillard did and sat down in the Prime Ministerial Courtyard with Bob Brown and Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, the infamous Sprigs of Wattle photo where they sat down and, signed a deal. He just won't do that. He'll basically say he will accept supply and confidence, which is the bare minimum you need to convince the Governor-General you can form a government on the floor of the House of Representatives. and some people may construe that as a deal, but that's not really a deal. He'll basically say to Adam Bant, the Greens leader, that, look, mate, you can either give us a blind confidence or you can give it to Peter Dutton, and then you can go and explain that to your supporters why you've done that. He'll call their bluff. He'll still do individual deals on legislation like they do now in the Senate. I mean, they need the Greens now to get stuff through Parliament because the Greens control the Senate when their coalition is opposed to a measure, which I suspect will be nearly every time in a hung Parliament. They'll negotiate on individual pieces of legislation, but there will be no sort of compact at the beginning saying, we will give you a price on carbon or put dental into Medicare or any of this other stuff the Greens want in return for you supporting us in government. He won't do that. And I think he's probably safe doing that because there's no way Adam Bant's going to run off and support Peter Dutton.
Andrew, we had the final leaders debate on Sunday night, and one of the big takeaways, other than how much a carton of egg costs, was both leaders' comments on the welcome to country. What did you make of Peter Dutton's claim they are overdone and of Anthony Albanese's decision not to challenge him?
Well, Lisa, this sort of stemmed from what happened on Anzac Day down at the Melbourne Dawn service, where some far-right extremists, allegedly neo-Nazis, booed the welcome to country service at the beginning of the Dawn service. Now, both leaders rightly condemned what had happened, but it sort of triggered this broader debate about welcome to country, and also to what I think Dutton is conflating with it, the acknowledgement of country statements that are said at the beginning of the meetings and things like that. I think here he sort of has tapped into a bit of a sentiment that these have proliferated to the point where they're becoming a bit meaningless, almost in some cases a box-ticking exercise, particularly around events. So that's where this idea of them being overdone has come from. The other point Dutton made on Monday was that he thought things like the Qantas giving acknowledgement of countries every time their plane lands was something where he thought was getting a bit overdone as well. So it's not quite in the political correctness gone mad, but it injects a little bit of culture wars into the debate. What was interesting, I thought, was in Albanese's response, where there was sort of almost like a tacit acknowledgement that Dutton was onto something. The PM sort of put the onus, the responsibility for decisions about whether welcome to country and acknowledgement of countries are done back on the individual organisations. He certainly, though, sort of, wasn't critical or things like that, but he did sort of wasn't in a hurry to try and defend them.
I would suspect it's almost a majority view that it's being overdone. But a lot of people don't want to say that because they'll be called racist or whatever. Whereas Dutton's prepared just to say it, that, it's being overdone. Albanese is also probably the view it's overdone, but he also doesn't want to annoy the left. So he just sort of sat on the fence. But as Andrew said, he definitely didn't refute it, and that was illustrative.
I think you're right that Dutton probably is tapping into something there, whether it's acknowledgement of country or welcome to country. Most people probably, or a lot of people wouldn't know the difference. My general understanding is that the welcome to country is typically conducted by an Indigenous person, often an elder who has a connection to that particular geography or land, whereas an acknowledgement of country can be conducted by anyone, whether they're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, acknowledging the custodians of land that people are meeting on. But I think there might be a sense out there that Dutton's tapping into, that whether you go to a conference or something, every speaker stands up before they speak, before their podium appearance, and says the same thing that the last speaker says, rather than just the welcome or acknowledgement of country at the start by the MC or by an elder. People might not want to talk about it publicly. It may not be totally politically correct. But I've certainly heard it from some people, even people who I'd say are progressive and in favour of doing it on special occasions.
Andrew, before we leave the debate, Peter Dutton also singled out China as the biggest threat to security. Do you think he's hardening up his view on China ahead of the vote?
Dutton has been pretty careful over the last 3 years to sort of tiptoe a bit around China. There's been this recognition that this hardline rhetoric that when he was Defence Minister in the previous government cost the coalition support among Chinese Australians. These are in seats like in Bennelong, in Sydney and Chisholm and Melbourne. So as opposition leader, he's been very conscious to try and sort of blunt some of that messaging, that criticism of China, win those supporters back. When the Chinese Premier was here last year, he spoke very positively about wanting to have a good trade relationship with China. The other element too was interesting, that Dutton made the point of saying his concern is not about China, but with the Communist Party of China. So he's making clear the quarrel's not with the 1.4 billion Chinese people, but rather their rulers, the Communist Party. So I think that's a bit of a distinction that often gets overlooked. But during the campaign, we've seen a little bit of maybe the rhetoric edge back in. Dutton's been very keen to criticise Albanese, paint him as a weak, soft leader on defence and national security. The example we had a couple of months ago of the Chinese flotilla completing the near circumnavigation in Australia, that's something where Dutton has been very keen to sort of go hard at Albanese, that he didn't make the point of standing up for Australia against China in those circumstances.
John, finally in this last week, both major parties are releasing their policy costings. Is this too little, too late? And how concerned should we be that credit ratings agency S&P has warned the country's AAA credit rating, the highest you can get, might be under threat?
So we've seen a lot of spending in this campaign, Lisa, and not just over the last 5 or 6 weeks, but over the last few months by Labor, particularly on health, and then on the Peter Dutton coalition side, matching a lot of that and then unleashing his own big defence spend of about $21 billion over 5 years. I think the problem is there really hasn't been any or many offsetting savings or tax rises to pay for the increased spending. Most of it's been put on the national credit card. And S&P, the ratings agency, did come out with a warning this week that if there's not appropriate savings offsets in the future, then the AAA rating might be at risk. I don't think there's an immediate risk to a downgrade of the AAA rating. This would be more of a slow burn thing. But, there's other factors putting pressure on the AAA too, particularly state government borrowings, particularly from Victoria and Queensland, who have both big debts as well. And that contributes to the national sovereign rating. But it would be a big deal because the banks and also the states actually piggyback off the government's AAA credit rating to get a better credit rating themselves and borrow lower funding costs, cheaper interest rates. So it is important to keep that AAA rating, but we do need to see, I think, some more fiscal discipline by either side of politics after this election to get the budget on a more sustainable medium-term trajectory. Labor says they've more or less done that. They're just going to continue on this sort of steady course that they're on. They don't seem to be committed to making major inroads after the election. The coalition's talked a big game, but yet we're really yet to see any major details about how they'd seriously repair the budget beyond just sort of broad rules about containing spending growth to less than economic growth and having a tax to GDP cap and things like that. They say they'll be more disciplined, but we still need to see a lot more details from them, including when they release their costings later this week.
And is one of the biggest concerns this off-budget spending, which is now more than $100 billion?
Absolutely. And this is for things like claimed investments that are meant to make a commercial return and generate money for the government by investing things like the NBN, which has been losing money, the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, the Snowy Hydro, which has had a huge cost blowout, the National Reconstruction Fund, somehow ended up in there too. And even the $16 billion debt forgiveness for student university loans is off budget. Now, this really is a sort of funny money program in the sense that Labor's use this to great propensity. They keep pointing to the underlying cash balance at the end of each financial year to say this is what the budget balance is going to be or was, but they're not including a lot of this sort of $104 billion of off-budget spending over 5 years, which it all adds up to gross debt. It's borrowed money. And so the underlying cash balance that governments like to point to is becoming less meaningful, and we should perhaps be focusing on other measurements like gross debt, like the headline cash balance, and debt's going to be on track to hit $1 trillion in the coming year.
Okay, well, we'll be right back after the break with all the latest from the polls, why the coalition believe their internal numbers are more positive, and which seats to look out for on election night. Welcome back to the Fin Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray and I'm talking with political editor Phil Coorey, Defence and Foreign Affairs correspondent Andrew Tillett and economics editor John Keogh. Phil, you talked a little bit about the polls at the start of the ep, but let's dig a little bit deeper into this increasing talk around the coalition that their internal polling is more positive. Do you believe them?
I do, to the point. It's more positive in net terms, Lisa, because, again, the Coalition and Labor don't do what we do. They don't just run a national poll to get a number, 51, 49 or 52. They track from the start of the campaign right throughout. They track 15, 20, 30 seats that they think will decide the election, right? So you might understand the Coalition is tracking 15 seats, 14 Labor seats plus its own seat of Leichhardt in Queensland. And every few days they poll all those seats. And that's much more use to them than some national figure, which, tells you nothing what's going on the ground level. That track plus Labor's own track shows a lot of those seats are no more than 1 or 2% apart in terms, and they're only smallish samples, but they could sort of go either way on the day. Then someone said to me today from the Coalition, we could wind up with 63 or 73 seats. There's so many of these seats are so tight. So that's one interpretation of behind what Dutton is saying. The other one, Lisa, is again I can't stress this enough that the nation is much more volatile now electorally than it's ever been. It's not just some states voting different to other states like we've seen in the past, like the resource states versus the southern states or something. There are differences within the states. And what Dutton is getting to, when he made that statement, he was out in the seat of Hawke, which is way out in the boondocks in the outer suburbs of Melbourne. It's been Labor heartland out there for as long as anyone can remember. Seats like Gorton, Hawke, Dunkley, that was a Liberal seat for a while. And we're looking at seats like Whitlam around Wollongong in New South Wales, regional outer suburban seats, cost of living, high crime rates, problems with immigration, all those sort of working class traditional issues that these are the sort of Howard Battler seats, if you like. And what's happening there is One Nation, Clive Palmer, Family First, they're getting double digit. They're polling between them well over 10%. And what we're seeing happening this time, Lisa, is up to 90% of those preferences are going towards the Liberal or Coalition, right? At the last election, the average was about 2/3. But these right-wing parties are harvesting disaffected Labor voters more than they have last election, and they're sending their preferences to the Coalition. This has been picked up in polls and exit polls from people who've already voted, plus polling of these seats. You might see on the day some or all of these seats going to the Coalition, Labor heartland seats, swinging wildly towards the Coalition, and some of them actually falling to the Coalition. Now, these weren't factored in at the start of the campaign. In of itself, it won't be enough to give Dutton victory on the day, but it might make for a much tighter result than we're seeing. And the only sort of other point I would add to that is that Labor's not disputing this either, right? And you're only going to look where Dutton is going, right? Look, he started on Sunday in the seat of Hawke, where he made that actual claim that it's tighter than it looks. So, there's always a bit of spin in this stuff, trying to get momentum going, but it'll just be fascinating on the night to see what happens in some of these seats.
So let's drill down into that a little bit, because as you say, you've got to watch it seat by seat. I want to ask each of you to nominate a seat that you think we should be watching closely on election night. What is that seat going to tell us about how the election goes? So give us a brief rundown of the contest and why it's important.
One of the seats that's going to interest me most is the outer western suburban seat of Gordon in Victoria. As we've just been talking about, it's been a Labor seat since 2004, since it was founded. It's been held since that time by Brendan O'Connor, a very popular local member, but it is now one of these seats with huge cost of living concerns, problems with migration, law and order is out of control, and it's one of these classic target seats that Dutton thinks he might pick up. With Brendan gone, the Labor candidate is a clean skin, a woman called Alice Jordan-Baird, up against the Liberals' John Fletcher, but they've also got Family First candidates, One Nation candidates, and a Libertarian candidate. And so between them, if they're getting over 10%, which cumulatively, which I understand they are, it could be one of those seats that either falls to the Liberals for the first time or comes very close to doing so.
Andrew, what's your pick?
I'm going to go to the Sunshine State and the seat of Brisbane. It's a three-way contest between the Liberals, the Greens and Labor. And funnily enough, It's the same three candidates that there was 3 years ago, so they've all got to save some money on posters. The seat was won by the Greens' Stephen Bates. He sort of benefited up there from the lack of a teal movement in Queensland at the last election. So he and a couple other Greens won seats there. Bates is being challenged by the former Liberal MP Trevor Evans, while Labor's running again Madonna Jarrett as its candidate. There's some interesting dynamics going on there in Brisbane. If Evans can get his primary vote back into the 40+% range, he's got a good shot of winning. But essentially it could come down to Labor and the Greens, and essentially who finishes third. Their preferences will decide the seat. Why I think it's one to watch is essentially if Anthony Albanese is to have any shot of holding on to majority government, Brisbane is one of those seats that he needs to win.
And what about you, John?
Well, the seat I'm really curious about is Bradfield in Sydney on the North Shore. Now, the retiring Liberal MP Paul Fletcher has vacated it, and he's been in Parliament for 15 years. Now, I've been told that he's actually told other senior business people in the electorate privately that this is the last remaining Liberal seat where ASX 100 CEOs typically live, because all the seats they have lost to Teals in Sydney and Melbourne have been wiped out. And that's where that sort of CEO class typically live, in those sort of teal electorates. Now, Bradfield's under threat from a teal. Nicole Buller, she is only behind on a 2.5% margin after redistribution. She's the teal candidate. Now, the Liberals do have a good credible candidate, Giselle Kapterian. She's a former trade lawyer, a former advisor in the coalition government on trade and related issues. She's also been a Salesforce executive. She has a migrant background. Her parents of Armenian background, actually, which coincides with Joe Hockey, who used to be the member for North Sydney, which bordered Bradfield, but now has been amalgamated into it after the North Sydney seat was abolished. So she's got quite a bit of support from the moderate wing of the Liberals. But if you look at the polling, you talk to people on both sides, there's a real danger for the Liberals they lose this Bradfield seat. And if they do lose it, it would speak to this whole shift in the Liberal Party, who they're appealing to, because we know Dutton is actually more going for the outer suburbs and the regions, those sort of seats. But if they can't hang on to a blue ribbon seat like Bradfield, that's a really bad sign for the Liberal Party going forward, because it means possibly they're going to lose more seats to the Teals, and they may struggle to pick any up that they lost at the last election as well. So I think it's a real key seat to watch. Nicole Buller, she ran against Paul Fletcher last time, got within 4.2%. Now Fletcher's standing down. She's actually been doing a lot of work in the community there for the last 3 years. She's maintained an electorate office. She's almost being the shadow electorate member there for the last 3 years. And this is a real test for the Teals as well, to see if they can make more inroads into Liberal heartland.
Okay, so Gorton, Brisbane and Bradfield will all be watching closely. Now, we have a listener question sent in by Carl Morgan from New South Wales. He asks, "For me, this election is about nothing. It appears that both sides are too scared to tell us what they will do if they win. What is your opinion of what either side will do if they get into power that they're not telling us?"
Well, I don't think Labor's not telling us much. They seem to be content the way things are going, but I suspect they'll need to do some more on the revenue side if they get in. I'm suspicious what they might do with family trusts. I mean, they've ruled out things like, or sort of ruled out things like superannuation, definitely ruled out negative gearing, capital gains discount, all the obvious ones. But, and I'm not saying this with any sense of knowledge or background knowledge, but at some stage they're going to have to start coming after people's wealth again. They don't seem to be too keen to stop spending, so they're going to have to balance the budget somehow. On the other side of the coin, the Liberals, they clearly they've stated clearly that they're going to have to cut spending. That's their preference, get your spending under control rather than tax people more. So I think the unknown in response to the question is both sides will come at budget repair, but from different sides, from different sides of the coin. And it's, we talk about cuts in the context of an election campaign as a dirty word, but in another man's language, it's responsible budget management. I noticed Angus Taylor sort of let slip yesterday that if elected, they will have a mini budget in the second half of the year. And that will probably, they'll start put some detail around where they're going to try and rein in the yawning deficits and debt that we have, whereas Labor's not sort of saying much other than the government's bad, the opposition's bad, and vote for us.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I'd agree with Phil on trust there. I suspect Labor's going to come under pressure, given they don't want to cut spending much, to raise more revenue from other things. And I think trust falls into this potential category. We saw Treasury put out a report last year saying 1.7 million people receive income from trusts, receiving about $60 billion a year. Now, they're low tax, concessionally taxed vehicles that allow you to split income amongst family members, take advantage of lower marginal tax rates. They're also legitimately used for business purposes by farmers and small businesses to protect assets. But I tend to agree with Phil that it is an area a Labor government would at least consider in its next term. Now, I don't say they've got an active secret plan right at this moment, but I think it's probably on the back burner there as a consideration to raise more revenue in a second term. On the other hand, if the coalition get into power, I suspect they would probably cut a bit harder on the spending side of things than what they're saying at the moment. They'd probably have another look at the NDIS and programs like that. Now, they don't want to, I think, scare people for this election. I don't think necessarily they'd have savage spending cuts and a return to the sort of 2014 Tony Abbott, Joe Hockey budget that was very unpopular, because I think they've learnt their lessons from that. But I do think they'd probably go a bit harder on the spending cuts on the other side of the election if they did happen to win the election.
Just having said that, Lisa, on Thursday or Friday, the Liberal Party will release its costings. And so we'll have a better idea then, because they've announced about $60 billion in measures since the campaign, or just before, since the campaign began. This is on over the forward estimates on top of what the stuff they're matching that Labor's doing, like the Medicare stuff, so another $60 billion. They've announced roughly about $40 billion in savings via measures from Labor they're not going to proceed with. So they're saying, and they said again yesterday, that the budget deficits will be smaller under them and they'll pay for everything. So we await with great interest their costings, because they've got to find about another $20 billion in savings, plus more money to give a bit more favourable budget outlook. So probably best answer this question in three to 4 days' time, but we'll have a better idea.
One of the few areas where the coalition has sort of outgunned Labor on election promises is on defence spending. I think inevitably Albanese and Defence Minister Richard Marles will face pressure to increase defence spending over the term. The Trump administration have made clear that they want to see Australia go up to 3% of GDP. We're on target under Labor's policies to get to 2.3 in the early part of the 2030s. So I imagine that is something that the government will have to revisit if they are back in power after next Saturday. But the other dynamic, I think, too, will perhaps be, if the government does end up with a majority, is the level of confidence and authority this will give Albanese to perhaps maybe chance his arm a bit more. Governments tend to be at their best in their second term. They've sort of ironed out any flaws. They know how the bureaucracy works. They're comfortable with the levers and power and things like that. So this will perhaps be sort of the real chance, if Labor is to be a reformist government, to take some risks and push the envelope a bit before the rot sort of sets in at the term after that, if they end up getting a third term.
And John, inflation's out on Wednesday?
Yes, and the underlying inflation rate, which is the one the Reserve Bank takes most notice of because it strips out the more volatile items for the March quarter, is expected to be a bit under 3%, so back inside the top half of the RBA's 2 to 3% inflation band. And most economists are actually banking on a rate cut at the May 20 RBA board meeting, not only because inflation seems to be moderating, but also because of what's going on in the world with Donald Trump's trade war. It's probably going to interrupt global growth and slow down the economy internationally, and that'll be felt in Australia to a degree as well. So I'd be surprised if we don't get that sort of sub 3% underlying inflation rate, and that's a good news story for the government to be able to spin and point to the potential likelihood of another rate cut on May 20, which will be 17 days after the election. So they won't be able to point to it as actual proof, but as a good likelihood. So no doubt Jim Chalmers will be out on Wednesday if they do get a promising inflation figure, spruiking that another rate cut could be on the cards soon.
Okay, well, just briefly before we go, where will you all be on election night?
I'll be in the office. Once you get on TV and filing like a madman.
I'll be sitting about 2 metres away from Phil in the office watching the results come in.
Yes, I'll be watching all the numbers roll in and paying great attention with interest to the results, not just the aggregate result, but the individual seat results, which I think are going to be very interesting in this campaign.
The electoral map is changing, and I think we'll see that writ large. The other highlight this week, obviously, Lisa, is we'll have our final Australian Financial Review Freshwater Strategy poll, which we'll be publishing Thursday night for Friday.
Mm-hmm.
Our numbers have been a bit tighter than everyone else's. We haven't done one for a couple of weeks. But I think one of the reasons our numbers are a bit tighter is because when we ask people who they're going to vote for, we also ask them how they're going to direct their preference. Whereas the other polls, they allocate preferences along the pattern they fell at the last election. And as we've been explaining, preferences are changing this election, this One Nation thing we've been talking about. So that may explain why we're getting slightly tighter two-party numbers than other polls. But I'll be very curious to see how much our poll has shifted in a fortnight and a bit on Friday.
We'll look out for that. Now, thanks, Andrew, John, very much for your time.
Great to be with you.
Great to be here, and let's do it again in 3 years' time.
And Phil, before you go, every episode we've been asking you to reveal your favourite quote of the week. What do you have for us in this last week of the campaign?
I'm not sure if it's the favourite, but it's the most telling, and I think it was the reference by Peter Dutton on Sunday to the ABC and The Guardian as the hate media. Now, he's been under strict instructions for some months now to sort of shelve that sort of language and stop beating up the ABC because everyone who agrees with him on that is already going to vote for him. I thought it was a slip. It was a momentary loss of composure. He was at the rally out at the Cedar Hawk, and echo chambers can always be dangerous when you're being cheered by the party faithful. And it was a spontaneous line, but I don't think it's helped him in the final days in terms of, reaching into teal seats and the likes where he might want to sort of win a few of the sort of progressive voters back towards his side.
Thanks, Phil.
No problem, Lisa, and thank you for all the listeners for listening to this throughout. And remember, don't forget to vote, because if you don't vote, you can't complain.
Forget about what you're being told by the ABC and The Guardian and the other hate media. Forget about that. Listen to what you're hearing on the doors. Listen to what people are saying on pre-polling.
Thank you for joining us for the Fin Election 2025. I'm Lisa Murray with Phil Coorey, Andrew Tillett and John Keogh. The Fin Election 2025 is produced by Lapfan and Alex Gow, with thanks to Debbie Harrington. Our theme is by Alex Gow. Lapfan is head of podcast. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us, as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you on Thursday when we discuss the future of racing and rugby league. Bye for now.
The Australian Financial Review.